Welcome to the Ames Public Library, both in person and virtually for this program, part of the 2022 History Lecture Series brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and the Ames History Museum. I'm Kathy Cooney, an Adult Services Librarian here at APL. The library's mission is to connect you to the world of ideas, which we do through diverse and inclusive resources and programming like tonight's event. For those of you on Zoom, please submit your questions through the Q&A or chat function linked at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll monitor those to make sure they are shared. If you get bumped out of the meeting, follow the original link to get back in. And we have enabled live captioning, which you can turn on by clicking the CC Live Transcript button in the Zoom menu bar and choosing closed captioning. I also have captioning enabled for the folks here. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Ames History Museum's YouTube channel after the event. You can also find it linked on the library's page at amespl.org/historylectures. With that, I will turn it over to Casey.
Thank you. I'm Casey Vance, Executive Director at Ames History Museum, and we're so pleased to have this wonderful partnership with the Ames Public Library for our lecture series. Thanks for joining us this evening. The Ames History Museum is a small nonprofit organization doing a big job with limited resources. We want to recognize and sincerely thank those in the audience who are currently members of the museum. This annual support provides essential funding for everything we do, and memberships are critical to our day-to-day service to the community and our ability to preserve archives and artifacts for present and future generations. If you're not a member and are interested in becoming one, you can find more information on our website, which is ameshistory.org. The museum is now actually closed. The building itself is closed for major renovations, which will be complete next year, summer 2024. And while the building is closed during construction, Ames History Museum staff and volunteers are still out and about sharing the history of Ames. Look for more information to come about pop-up exhibits in the community, special lectures and tours, digital research resources, and more. And again, please check our website, ameshistory.org, for more information about the expansion project and upcoming exhibits and events out in the community. And now I will turn it over to Kathy Speck to introduce our speaker this evening.
I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. David Mills, who is coming to us from Leavenworth, Kansas. Dr. Mills is an associate professor who joined the Department of Military History at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College in 2016 at Fort Leavenworth. Dr. Mills spent 10 years in the United States Army, serving as an air defense artillery officer, including service in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He was the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, having taught for a semester in the Russian Federation at UFA University. He holds a PhD from North Dakota State University and is the author of 3 books on military and Cold War history. His current research project examines the effort to feed Germany from the fall of Hitler through the Marshall Plan. And this research has resulted in a book that is currently being reviewed by publishers. So David, we're so pleased to have you here tonight, and we'll let you begin.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. And just a quick note to the listeners, I'm a history major. I am not an IT expert. And so chances are I'm going to screw something up and probably lose my PowerPoint slides somewhere in here. So please just bear with me. Also, a quick note, this presentation is not just about the friendship train in Iowa. As Kathy just alluded to, I've been doing a fair amount of research on feeding Germany and all of Europe for that point after World War II. So a fair amount of the information that we're going to talk about tonight is going to be a reflection of this research. So specifically, the period that I examined are the 3 years between 1945 and 1948, but also includes some research on Iowa that I think you'll enjoy. So specifically, I'm going to discuss 2 topics today of importance to the people from Iowa, which includes the friendship train and also some information about Herbert Hoover. Keep in mind that throughout this presentation that it's important that Germany recover economically, politically, socially, after World War II. All of Europe depends on the reconstruction of Germany, which is not necessarily a very popular idea at the time. But as comedian Ron White says, before I tell you that story, I have to tell you this one. So let's go back to 1914 and the start of World War I. So Germany is invaded through Belgium to get to France, and immediately the British set up a blockade against Germany. No food or medicine can get through, and you can see on the map here the lines that depict the blockade. Germany had imported about 20% of all of the food that they required before the war. So when the blockade cuts off all of their food imports, they simply took food from Belgium to make up the difference. Belgium had imported about 70% of the food that they required before the war. So with Germany stealing their food, Belgium is starving. So enter Herbert Hoover onto the scene. He's a multi-millionaire, having earned his money from mining ventures around the world. And as many of you know, he hailed from Iowa. Although he's mostly known for terrible economic policies enacted at the start of the Great Depression, most of you probably know that he is one of the greatest humanitarians in history. He forms an organization called the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. He negotiates with Germany, France, and England, all nations at war at this time, to bring American food into Belgium to relieve the suffering. Surprisingly, the Germans don't steal the food. It goes to the Belgian people, saving lives there. Later, Hoover is going to head up the United States Food Administration, yet another nonprofit organization charged with providing food to the U.S. Army. So in November of 1918, the war comes to an end. One of the reasons for the German surrender was this blockade. The Germans at home are starving. After the war, though, the British keep the blockade in place to punish the Germans for the death of millions of British and French soldiers and to force them to sign a punitive or punishing Versailles Peace Treaty. President Woodrow Wilson strongly objects to punishing the Germans after World War I. He believes it will bring about another bigger and deadlier war later on. And he's right, but he's overruled by France and England, who have more political sway than Wilson does. But here's kind of the important point. 50 to 750,000 Germans starved to death due to the blockade, of which about 300,000 Germans starved to death after the end of the war, purely as a punishment for the German people. Now, with Belgium able to import food after the end of the war, Hoover turns his attention to Germany. He forms yet another organization called the American Relief Administration to administer food and aid to Germany as soon as the British lift the blockade in July of 1919. But Hoover is not done with his humanitarian missions because there's a famine in the Soviet Union between 1921 and 1922. Hoover mobilizes the American Relief Administration to switch from giving food and aid to Germany to giving food and aid to Russia. So although the famine is over by 1923, many Americans had objected to feeding the communists. After all, the Red Scare is going on in the United States, where people were terrified that communists were taking over the country. In response, Hoover says this. He says, "We must make some distinction between the Russian people and the group that have seized the government. I think you will need to separate in your mind the 200,000 communists in Russia from the 150 million Russian people." Between 1914 and 1923, Hoover distributes a total of about $3 billion in food relief to various nations, measured in 1923 dollars. So, and historians estimate that he saved about 20 million lives, of which about 9 million were children. So here's the important point. Feeding starving nations was important to Americans because it was within our value system to do so. Right? As Americans, we don't like to see people suffer. And just as importantly, it's in our interest to prevent the spread of communism, which thrives in darkness and misery. People will trade their freedom for food. And as one of my students once said, where values and interests intersect, that's where action happens. So Iowans have a long and proud tradition of generosity. So before the turn of the 20th century and before the 1922 famine in Russia, which was largely a federal effort and not a state effort, before the turn of the 20th century, the people of Iowa sent money to support a number of causes, like those devastated by the 1884 Ohio floods, the Charleston, South Carolina earthquake, the 1889 Johnstown flood, in which Iowans sent food and lumber with which to rebuild the town, and clothing to those hardest hit by the Johnstown flood. And the good people of Iowa responded again when an earlier famine hits Russia in July of 1891, when drought in the spring had devastated the grain harvest. Millions were hungry and faced a slow and agonizing death unless the generosity of others more fortunate prevailed. And so Clara Barton, as many of you know, she was the founder of the Red Cross. She singled out Iowans for their contributions to the Russian famine. She said, the state of Iowa led all others in active generosity. That state raised and sent in trains across the country from Iowa to New York, 117,000 bushels of corn and 100,000 pounds of flour. Now, this generosity is going to become important a little bit later on when we start talking about the post-World War II era. All right, but let's get back to Germany for a second and talk about the conditions in Germany at the end of World War I. So in sum, the Versailles Peace Treaty devastated Germany. The nation had no military. They're forced to accept blame for starting the war. They lost territory to the Allies. And the Germans must pay reparations as well. In other words, they have to pay the cost of the entire war, for the British and French particularly. They say it's impossible to put a price on human life, but the Allies did it, and they handed the bill to the Germans. Having to pay the Allies reparations had crippled the German economy. So take a look at this picture on the left. Can you see what this woman is doing? She's burning money because it is so worthless. Now, in 1918, 1 German mark was worth about $1. However, with galloping rampant hyperinflation, by July of 1923, $1 was worth 4 trillion marks. So imagine going to the grocery store and having to have enough cash with you to buy groceries, or driving up to a McDonald's drive-through, ordering off the dollar menu and having to have $4 trillion in cash to pay for your burger, right? That's how badly the German economy was devastated. So as a result of the Versailles Peace Treaty, Germany is shattered financially, politically, economically. They're humiliated. What do you want more than anything if you're a German in the 1920s and the 1930s? You want somebody to lead you out of this problem. So it's important to remember that Hitler was elected to head the German government. He did not overthrow the German government to take control. So he immediately starts to rearm Germany when he comes to power in 1933, and the Allies do nothing. Right, the majority of the German people are thankful that a strong person has risen to the highest ranks of the German government, and he promises to make life easier for the German people. And then we all know what happened, right? As many predicted, World War I was not the war to end all wars. It was the opening round for a bigger and far deadlier war. World War II starts when Germany invades Poland in 1939. They invade France in 1940, and then the Soviet Union in 1941. Hitler had conquered much of Western and Central Europe, and he stole food to feed his army, and he steals a lot of food and he sends it back to Germany. The United States will get involved in the war after Pearl Harbor in 1941. And even though the nation wants revenge against Japan, the Roosevelt administration settles on a Europe first policy. The world cannot tolerate Europe dominated by Hitler. We can eventually sort out the Japanese in the Pacific, right? But a Hitler in Europe running wild is just something too terrible to contemplate. So this is a pretty interesting map. Take note of all of the nations that Germany has conquered and occupied. Like the previous war, Germany has done nothing to substantially invigorate their agricultural productivity. So German farmers still cannot feed their own population. They had still imported about 20% of all of their food needs before the war. But once the war started, they simply took whatever they wanted from the nations that they conquered, including slave labor, food, and anything of value that they could get their hands on. So as this slide says, this is the high tide of German conquest. By 1943, they're retreating back towards Germany for the rest of the war. And then we all know what happens with the Holocaust. So there's simply no sympathy for Germany when they unconditionally surrender in 1945. So as we know, Germany loses the war and they have numerous problems after it. Many Germans are soon starving since their farmers can't provide all of the food they require and they can't steal any more food from their neighbors that they've conquered. To make matters worse, the Soviets take a bunch of land from eastern Poland, and then to compensate Poland, Poland takes land from eastern Germany in return. That's this area here that you see that says Polish. Right, so this matters because this is Germany's most productive farmland. So at the same time, millions of ethnic Germans are thrown out of Eastern Europe and millions of slave laborers are already in Germany when the war ends. They all come to Western zones, the Western zones controlled by the Allies, the Americans, the British, and the French. So what this means is, with 25% less farmland than the Allies had at the beginning of the war, and with 10 more million people in a nation that, even at the best of times, had imported 20% of their food needs, Germany is in a world of hurt when it comes to feeding all of these people, particularly in the Western zones, where the British control this zone in the north, the French control this occupation zone in the west, and the Americans control an occupation zone in the southeast. And you can see the Soviet occupation zone, this purple and red area. So Germany is literally divided up among the Allies for control into the post-war era. So Germany is not the only nation that is starving. All of Europe is hungry after World War II, particularly the Dutch, after a brutal occupation by the Germans. On the left is a 9-year-old Henkie Holvast, a Dutch boy who had a habit of carrying a spoon with him wherever he went, just in case, as he would often say, just in case he had need to use it. But you can see the results of the occupation of the Dutch. At some points, the Dutch are down to about 500 calories per day. It's simply designed by the Germans for the cruelty that they could inflict. All right, so on the right is General Lucius Clay, in charge of the German occupation in the American zone. He's given this occupation plan called JCS 1067, not that the name of it is very important, but Truman doesn't even sign it until June of 1945, a month after Germany surrenders, because the Allies, the Americans, are simply not sure what they want to do with Germany, and they're more interested in winning the war than the post-war period. It turns out that the plan is pretty vague, not a lot of direction. It's more of a guideline, but it gives Clay a lot of leeway as the commander of the American zone and how he's going to run things. So he also understood that the people had to eat. As he said, there's no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000. However, he had problems convincing the Truman administration that he needs food early on. The main problem with the occupation plan was that it did not allow Germany to produce industrial goods. Everybody is terrified that if you allow Germany to produce in their factories and these industrial goods, that they'll start building tanks and planes again and start another world war. So the Allies really keep a lid on the amount of manufacturing that they can do. This is kind of important because Germany has habitually been a producer of lots of Europe's industrial goods, which they sell and then use the profits from which to purchase more food for their population. As one member of Clay's staff said when he examines JCS 1067, this guy was an investment banker from New York, and he says, this thing was assembled by economic idiots. It makes no sense to forbid the most skilled workers in Europe from producing as much as they can for a continent which is desperately short of everything. Remember, all of Europe will starve until Germany is rehabilitated economically, which is why I keep focusing on that. So German agriculture can only provide about 1,000 calories a day for its citizens, and they use excess military rations at the end of World War II to make up about 500 more calories. And between 1945 and 1948, for 3 years, 1,500 calories per person is the goal for the Allies to provide for German citizens. So Truman is determined not to make the same mistakes that the British and the French made after World War I. He did not want a defeated Germany to rise up again, starting another world war. However, he didn't understand that Germany was starving or how desperate the situation actually was. So it's easy to say that you don't care if somebody starves. It's quite another thing to watch it happen. So this is a reflection of American values and interests. Our American values dictate that we don't allow people to suffer, and the Truman administration made a determined effort for the 3 years after the war to provide food for the Germans. We also didn't want to see the Germans start another world war or see the rise of another Adolf Hitler. And as the Cold War begins to heat up, our interests lie in not allowing the communists to flourish in Western Europe due to food shortages. So we have to, the Truman administration eventually figures out, look, we have to provide food for the German people. So in summary then, take a look at this map and take a look at the nations with the diagonal stripes going through them. These are all of the nations in Europe that are receiving less than 1,900 calories per day. And there are a lot. Some are receiving less than 1,000 calories a day. In Germany, they're hoping, or the aspiration is that we can provide 1,500 calories a day. We often don't hit that number. Italy is down less than 1,000 calories a day at times. And then you see a number of other nations that are also pretty hungry. So immediately after the end of the war, Germany has two problems concerning food. First, they can't produce industrial goods for export in order to pay for the food. And second, German farmers are not producing enough food. They simply can't. They're wedded to these ancient family traditions of farming rather than embracing science and trying to maximize food production. And what they are producing, they refuse to bring to the cities where money is pretty worthless. I mean, kind of just like after the First World War, cash, or the German money is simply worthless. A trade or a barter system emerges where people trade for things that they need because cash won't work. The only thing that they've got close to cash is when they use cigarettes or chocolate bars as a form of currency. Farmers, on the other hand, are eating well, but the people in the cities are often going without food, and many of them will travel to the countryside on a fairly regular basis to trade family heirlooms for food. By December of 1945, the Truman administration finally understands the situation in Germany. Starvation will lead to food riots or an embrace of communism, and they got to start sending food to Germany. So the good news is that the US wheat crop in 1945 has broken all previous records. The Truman administration eagerly awaited the Department of Agriculture report just showing how much wheat was actually in American inventories so they could determine how much of it to ship to Europe. The bad news was that most of the grain from the 1945 harvest had already been fed to livestock to help alleviate the nationwide meat shortage. People had lots of money from the war effort, which had pulled the United States out of the Great Depression, as working for defense industries and factories and other jobs had paid quite well. And people wanted meat, which they couldn't get much of during the Depression, and they're willing to pay top dollar for it. So there's simply not much grain to ship to Europe or Germany for that matter. At the same time, a worldwide famine hits. Everybody is short of grain. So who are you going to call to fix your food problems? In 1946, Truman calls on Herbert Hoover to help find food for Europe. Hoover suggests creating an organization that will inform Americans of the urgency of the situation, much like he did after during and after World War I, excuse me. So you got to convince the American people of the urgency of the situation and get Americans to voluntarily help solve the problem. Truman likes the idea, and he creates an organization called the Famine Emergency Committee. He selects 12 prominent Americans to serve on the executive committee and 125 other citizens to serve as organization members whose job it is to spread the word about the need to save grain in their hometowns and cities. Truman calls on every governor to help spread the word as well. There are lots of radio advertisements and billboards reminding people to save grain. So the main idea was to get Americans to save one slice of bread a day. If you save one slice of bread a day, that will equate into enough grain saving that you can save Germany and as a result save all of Europe. Plus reduce the number of cakes and pies and other foods containing grains. You save it all for shipment to Germany and Europe. The downside of this program was that it's all voluntary, which was its greatest vulnerability. Overall, the project was not very effective. People could not see how saving one slice of bread a day is going to help feed an entire continent, and so they simply didn't. However, this is Herbert Hoover we're talking about. So Hoover takes a trip around the world looking for grain. He talks some national leaders out of importing grain that they didn't really need, and he talks others into giving up grain when they already had some extra on hand. At Hoover's request, the Pope broadcast a message to South America asking Catholics there to give up grain for Europe, which Hoover said was very effective. America did not have great relations with Juan Perón of Argentina at the time, but Hoover convinced him to give up enough grain to keep Germany from starving. This meant that the Germans had access to the same 1,500 calories per day. So all of this effort was simply to maintain this minimal amount of food. As one German said, the food provided was not enough to live on, but it wasn't enough to die on either. After a tough 1946, everybody was banking on 1947 being a much better year. And again, the American wheat harvest broke all records. But the American corn crop was severely damaged by floods in the Midwest. American farmers fed even more wheat to their livestock due to the scarcity of corn and because the prices of hogs and cattle was so high. And on top of that, the European harvest is devastated by cold weather. The US had pulled out all of the stops in 1946 to send 450,000 bushels of wheat to Germany. Now they need that much plus 100,000 more bushels over and above what they had sent the previous year to avoid starvation. Again, this is just to maintain the 1,500 calories per day level. At the same time, relations with the Soviets was at an all-time low. The Americans and British ignored the Soviets and French desires, and they began to set up the Western zones, looking to create a West Germany. The key to successfully creating the nation of West Germany was economic reconstruction. The key to economic reconstruction is food. Instead of minimizing manufacturing, the US begins encouraging German manufacturing in 1947. The occupation plan JCS 1067 is replaced with JCS 1779. Again, not that the numbers are important, but this new plan authorized the production of steel and iron for export to pay for imported food. But here's the problem. Even though manufacturing was now encouraged, workers did not have enough calories or strength to make production possible. Here's why starvation prevented economic recovery in 1947. In 1944, Dr. Ansel Keys from the University of Minnesota begins a starvation study to understand how it affects the human body. The Army wanted to understand how starvation would affect the military occupation. So Keys selected 36 test subjects, all of whom were conscientious objectors, but they wanted to serve their country anyway. Each was in good shape, all had some college. They averaged about 153 pounds in weight, and then Keys systematically starved them. Each man got about 1,570 calories per day, about what the Germans were getting, and they walked numerous miles a day, up to 20 miles a day, just like the Germans were doing, who had no transportation infrastructure. Staffers quickly recorded a loss in strength, speed, and coordination of each man, and starvation began to take its toll. Body temperatures dropped from a normal of 98.6 degrees to 95.8 degrees, almost 3 full degrees. Resting heart rate dropped from 55 beats per minute to 35 beats per minute. The lowest recorded beats per minute was 28. And edema, or the distended belly that we associate with starvation, became evident in some. Additionally, scientists tracked 3 drives: the need for sex, the need for activity, and the need for food. Sex drive diminished within the first couple of weeks. The men stopped dating. And then apathy was evident soon after. The men simply didn't care what was going on around them. However, their concern for food was paramount. They dreamed about it, they planned how to get more of it, and they tried to alleviate hunger pains that they experienced each day. By the end of the starvation phase, overall fitness for each of the men had dropped by 72%. The group had lost on average about 37 pounds, with each man down to about 115 pounds, or losing almost 25% of their body weight. On average, each man also lost about 1/3 of a centimeter in height. The average heart had shrunk 17%, and the liver and intestines of each man had shrunk also. When the human body experiences starvation, it'll shut off calories to the major organs, causing them to atrophy. What was hardest to quantify, though, was the apathy. The men had no strength to do labor, and they simply didn't care about anything but finding more food. So German manufacturing could not get up and running without food. This sign reads, "We want coal, we want bread." German miners did not get enough calories to mine coal necessary for heating homes and running factories. Coal miners needed over 4,000 calories a day to mine coal. And even though they got a special ration for their demanding physical labor, it was never enough. Their daily ration was only about 2,000 calories, and most miners brought home the food that they got from the mines, and they shared it with their families. So this affects morale and productivity, because tens of thousands of Germans get frostbite each winter because they have nothing with which to heat their homes. To meet those food challenges in 1947, the Truman administration sets up the Citizens Food Committee. This was not your old famine emergency committee. Here, President Truman on the left and Charles Luckman on the right, who is the head of the Citizens Food Committee, gives the first press conference in the history of the White House, explaining the need to save grain for Europe. Not only did they again ask people to voluntarily save bread for shipment overseas, but they take a much tougher approach in collecting grain for shipment. Truman shuts down the distilling industry for 90 days, and he gets the baking industry to use less grain, and then he asks the poultry industry to produce fewer eggs and frying chickens. The most effective way to save grain, Luckman says, was to institute various days of the week where they would give up eggs, poultry, and other meats. For example, American citizens were asked to give up meat, beef and pork, on Tuesdays and eggs and poultry on Thursdays. Committee said that this would save grain by driving down the demand for these items. The poultry, beef, and pork industry said it would actually consume more grain by having to feed livestock for longer periods. What the committee was actually trying to do was to force the various industries into reducing the eggs, chicken, hogs, and cattle produced overall by cutting into their profit margins. The committee dropped the meatless and eggless days, and in exchange, the livestock industry came up with reasonable plans to save grain. The effort was successful overall, getting huge reductions in egg and poultry production especially, but they also got the pork and cattle industries to ship livestock at leaner weights, saving grain for Germany and Europe. All right, finally, we get to the friendship train. Thanks for your patience. So people did not want to go without bread, but they would donate grain if they were asked. Drew Pearson was a well-known journalist in 1947, and he envisioned the greatest display of Cold War pageantry at the time. He proposed a train traveling from Los Angeles to New York, picking up donated food as it went. People from all walks of life, rural and urban, contributed to the effort. Small towns arranged for a railroad car full of condensed milk, wheat, flour, dried beans, or macaroni for shipment overseas. And when the train stopped to collect boxcars, people would give speeches about the effort, which generated a lot of excitement. Pearson hoped to collect 80 boxcars full of food. His train collected over 100. But eventually, he gets 800 rail cars full of food after at least 6 more trains copied the effort and hit the areas that the friendship train had missed. The main target of Peterson's generosity was France and Italy, 2 nations in which communists were making dangerous inroads through the ballot box rather than taking control by force. So one of Pearson's main objectives was to put signs on the food so the Europeans would understand that it was donated by Americans, as the communists took credit for much of the food previously sent in plain white sacks. He called this the friendship train. And you can see the route of the friendship train and the fact that it travels right through Iowa, which we'll talk about in a second. So to celebrate the friendship train, Pearson arranged for a parade in Los Angeles and Hollywood, seen by 100,000 spectators who lined the streets of Hollywood, and he invited movie stars to give the train a glamorous send-off. Some question whether the union would allow them to appear, but a message was sent to the president of the Screen Actors Guild, Ronald Reagan, and he gave his immediate approval for the actors to show up and support this effort. Over 130 screen actors and personalities appeared on a stage set up for the send-off ceremony, and then they rode parade floats that the film studios had built. Some of the stars you may or may not have heard of, including Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, Eddie Arnold, Lucille Ball, Glenn Ford, Ava Gardner, Alan Hale, Gabby Hayes, Van Johnson, Myrna Loy, Jane Wyman, John Wayne, Richard Widmark, and Robert Young, just to name a few. These are the actors that I wrote about that I recognize, and there were dozens and dozens more. All right, so the friendship train had generated tremendous publicity as it rolled across the country, and the citizens of Iowa had prepared a generous welcome. The state had rolled up the largest contribution of any in the nation, according to Drew Pearson, perhaps because of their connection with Europe forged the year before. 2 Iowa farmers came aboard the friendship train and when it stopped in Council Bluffs, and they rode it the whole way across the state. And their names were Elsie Peterson of Stanton and Otis Tuttle of Norway. They, along with 20 other Iowa farmers, had paid their own way to Europe the previous summer to see what the food situation was actually like. And upon their return home, they testified that the situation in Europe was very desperate. People were close to starvation, and they came and they informed the people of Iowa, giving speeches and letting them know what was going on. All right, so the friendship train made 6 stops in Iowa, beginning with Council Bluffs, followed by Boone, Ames, Marshalltown, Cedar Rapids, and finally Clinton. The people of Iowa had donated 22 full rail cars of food, the most of any state, and cash and food donations totaled over $100,000. Iowa Governor Robert Blue boarded the train in Omaha, Nebraska, and on November 12, 1947, he continued the tradition of governors riding the train across their state. Railroad engineers had split the train into 2 sections to get over the Rocky Mountains, and both trains rolled into Council Bluffs at 10 p.m. on November 12th. One locomotive pulling 45 cars left Council Bluffs a few hours later, headed to Chicago. The governor and 500 shivering members of the crowd, standing in 20-degree temperatures, watched as crews connected 5 rail cars full of food to the train that would cross Iowa. The citizens of Council Bluffs accounted for 2 of the cars filled with wheat, while citizens from Boyden, Sioux Center, Hull, Rock Valley, Orange City, and Stanton contributed enough food to add the other 3 cars at the train's first stop. So this train left Council Bluffs at 8:50 a.m. on November 13th and proceeded along its scheduled route across Iowa, pulling 17 cars. The friendship train pulled into the next stop at Boone, Iowa at 1:30 p.m., where over 3,000 children and adults took part in the parade celebrating the train's arrival, while marching bands from throughout Boone County added an air of celebration. A cheering crowd estimated between 12 and 15,000 was on hand to greet the train and its distinguished passengers that included French and Italian representatives, and Drew Pearson received wild applause as each in turn thanked the members of the Boone community for their generous donations. Contributions from Boone and the surrounding communities equaled 4 cars, including 1 of cornmeal, 1 of corn, and 2 filled with wheat, along with a check for over $2,000 made payable to the Friendship Train project. Total food and cash contributions from Boone totaled over $12,000. The Friendship Train next rolled into Ames and was a huge success. The cash collection effort was a tremendous success as well, collecting over $15,780. If you can see the donkey in the newspaper, it was auctioned off numerous times within a few hours, all of the money being donated to raise money for the effort. The town of Ames had purchased 2 carloads of flour and 1 more of evaporated milk for shipment to Europe, while collection efforts in Des Moines had raised enough cash to purchase another rail car of condensed milk, which was also attached at Ames. So when the train arrived in town, the Ames High School marching band provided music to the brief celebration carried out while the engineers connected the additional cars. Drew Pearson spoke to the assembled crowd in Ames, telling them that the point of the Friendship Train was to acquaint the people of Europe with the fact that the food is coming from the American people. The Friendship Train will be one method of combating the insidious propaganda of some countries taking credit for our gifts of food. Governor Blue follows Pearson, telling the crowd, we have gathered to extend the hand of friendship to the hungry people across the sea. The most important things for the people of the world today is to learn how to live together. All right, so in Marshalltown, collections continue throughout the state. Food committees in Marshalltown collected over 60,000 pounds of food, enough to fill 1 rail car with a variety of needed goods. The railroad crews connected it, and then the train moved on. You can see from the headlines that Marshalltown donated that rail car full of food, which included a ton of honey from one resident that he had donated. All right, so a crowd of between 10 and 15,000 assembled at Green Park in Cedar Rapids to celebrate the train's arrival and present the carloads of oats for shipment to Europe. Referring to the 81 total carloads of food collected thus far in the journey, which includes the other train that had already moved ahead, Pearson replies, "We never expected that we would have that much when we pulled into Chicago on Friday night. The town's achievement was the result of only a few days' effort by an energetic committee, and one of the members, Rex Kahn, farm editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette, said that we all know that the friendship train will provide only about a drop in the bucket of what is required, but it will make the French and Italians aware that the United States is the nation that is feeding them." All right, so most of the food collected in this first friendship train went to Italy and France. The French were so grateful for the contributions from the Americans that they proposed a special display of thanks. Railway workers in France suggested sending a train comprised of the old 40 and 8 boxcars, named so because they could fit 40 men and 8 horses, and they were used by the Americans in World War I. So they would send one car to each of the 48 states as a souvenir. For gifts, people suggested books about France, photographs of France, artwork, children's toys, lace, embroidery, antiques, perfume, dresses, and hats. Additionally, the rail cars contained thousands of letters written by the children in France and addressed to the children in the United States. So the train traveled throughout France, much as the original friendship train had traveled through the United States, picking up gifts from local organizations and filling all 48 cars. Once the rail cars reached the United States, they hooked up to 4 different locomotives, dropping 1 rail car for each of the states. What happened to the gifts contained in each car was left entirely up to the states. But here you can see the Merci train car, or the thank you train car, still sits on display near Cedar Rapids. All right, so the United States might have continued to feed Germany indefinitely, except for 3 significant programs that gets Germany back on its feet, able to produce enough food to feed itself, and in turn to rehabilitate all of Europe. First, the Marshall Plan sent $13 billion to 16 nations over 4 years, enough to rehabilitate the European economy, including Germany. This allowed them to fix transportation problems, ramp up their agricultural programs, and factories increased manufacturing, which allowed them to use the money from exports to pay for imported food. Second, currency reform in the Western zones in early 1948 gave farmers the confidence they needed in the national money. One of the reasons there was not enough food was that farmers would not sell their crops for worthless cash. Now they were no longer afraid to trade their commodities for cash and move Germany away from the barter system and black market system that had arisen. So food that had been hidden and hoarded away suddenly appeared on grocery store shelves and in cities. The communists absolutely hated currency reform because it only applied to the Western zones, and it signaled to the Soviets the American willingness to go their own way and do what was best for Europe, such as creating West Germany. So in the long term, this ushered in the Cold War that lasted for decades. And finally, the creation of West Germany and NATO in 1949 was key in giving the Germans the confidence that Europe and America would not abandon Germany to the Soviets. Nobody envisioned a Soviet invasion of Western Europe in the late 1940s, but many were afraid that the Germans would vote for communists into their government, doing Stalin's bidding. As a matter of fact, Italy and France had voted many members of the communist parties into their central government, which is why Pearson had targeted those 2 countries with a friendship train. So knowing that the United States stood beside them gave Germany the confidence to reject Soviet communism. In the Western zones, the food problem was largely fixed by October 1948. Berlin is a different story, however, as the fixes that the Western zones enjoyed had not reached Berlin. All of the food that the people in Berlin consumed had to be brought in from the Western zones, and there was never enough of it. In response to the Marshall Plan, currency reform, and the negotiations for the creation of West Germany and NATO, the Soviets had cut all rail, road, and barge traffic coming into Berlin in June of 1948. The city is already short on food, and the Soviet objective was to starve Berliners into submission and to push the Allies out of Berlin and ultimately out of Germany. However, President Truman simply resolved to remain in Berlin, and the Allies stumbled upon the fact that an airlift could supply the city. At first, nobody thought it would work, simply because it had never worked before. But over time, the airlift brought in everything that the city needed to survive and was in place for over a year when the Soviets simply gave up and lifted the blockade. It was a humiliating defeat for them. So the experience brought the Americans and Germans closer together than ever before, and the two nations continue as close allies even today. In conclusion, then, between 1945 and 1948, the United States and the British did not give in to the temptation to bring about a punitive peace onto Germany. This may have been satisfying initially, but to do so may have brought about a Third World War. Additionally, it was neither in our value system nor our interest to starve the Germans after World War II. Likewise, we would not allow the Soviet Union to absorb another sovereign nation into their orbit where we could prevent it. The people of Iowa were important soldiers in the fight against communism, while the friendship train played a pivotal role in providing food to the starving people of Europe. And with that, if anyone has any easy questions, I would be happy to try and answer them. Thank you.
We have one question so far typed in.
Okay.
Was there a relationship between the friendship train and care packages that were being sent overseas? This commenter said, after World War II, my grandmother sent care packages to families in the region of northern Germany her parents had immigrated from.
Yeah, that is a great question. They were related in the sense that Americans were trying to do something to alleviate the suffering of the German people. And pretty early on, right after the war, care packages started to be sent to Germany. Interestingly, though, the army, the United States Army, prevented the distribution of care packages, at least initially, fearing that only the rich people will be able to get the care packages, and the poor people won't get any. And so there will be a discrepancy between who gets them and who doesn't. And as a matter of fact, it's Hoover in 1946 who says, well, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You've got food sitting in a warehouse that you're not distributing yet. So Hoover not only demands that they distribute all of those care packages, and they were distributed pretty equally. Whoever wanted one could essentially get one. But there was also another interesting program that was started. I am from Worthington, Minnesota, and there was a young woman, a young lady, a middle schooler, I think, who had a pen pal who was from Finland, who said, "Hey, we're hungry. We don't have shoes. The shoes that we have are made out of paper. Can you send us some stuff?" And so they heard actually about how Germany was in a much worse situation in other nations as well. And so they contacted their senator, who put him in contact with the State Department, who said, Worthington, Minnesota, you got about 8,000 people who live in the town. You're a very agricultural place. Here's this town of Kreilsheim, Germany, that is also about the same size and also very agricultural. And they created a sister city relationship. And most of you have probably seen, as you drive into various towns, that you'll see, hey, here's Millersville, right? It is a sister city of wherever. That entire effort started in the town that I am, my adopted hometown, where somebody simply said, look, we want to do something, we don't know how to help. And so the State Department set up this relationship, this sister city relationship that actually exists even to this day. There are, every year there are exchanges in the summertime between Germany and Worthington, Minnesota. Every year we send a high school student to Kreilsheim, Germany. They send a high school student to Worthington, Minnesota. So when I say that this is in our interest to try and feed people, we hate to see people starving. The care packages are a perfect example that I had forgotten about, actually, that kind of illustrates that notion. So thank you for that question.
How many friendship trains did you say there were, and in what time period did they go all across the country?
So I know of the original friendship train plus 6 more. There was actually a couple of friend ships as well. There was a cargo ship that was berthed in Seattle, Washington, and it collected donations from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska, actually. And so it it steams around through the Panama Canal, and it brings food. There was a couple of trains that go through the southwest United States and the southeast United States, because the main effort simply went through the Great Plains and the Midwest, and it had missed the Southwest, the Southeast, and the Northeast and the Northwest. So there was actually a truck convoy from Michigan that made its way to New York, and all of this food gets put on to these ships, and eventually Germany and Austria and Holland are going to be targets of some of these friendship trains and ships that will make their way across the ocean as well. So, and the time frame you asked about, almost immediately after the first friendship train in October of 1947, by February of 48, I think the enthusiasm and interest had kind of run its course, and everybody had kind of finished with the trains and ships. But it's also pretty quickly after that Europe starts being able to feed itself because of the currency reform and the Marshall Plan in 1948. So the need for those trains is kind of overcome by events by this time.
Someone said they are watching from Pennsylvania tonight, and they're wondering if you know if Pennsylvania was as generous as Iowa was.
I have not done any research specifically on Pennsylvania, but and I know that it only hits a few towns in Pennsylvania. So let me see if I can figure out. I think I was actually kind of feeling pressed for time, so I skipped over some of the different towns that it went to. I don't see it. I guess I cut that part out. I know it went to Altoona, Philadelphia, and maybe one other town, but the objective was to get it done and get the food to New York. And so there was oh wait, nope, sorry, I don't see it. Sorry about that. I don't have it, but it was only a couple of towns in Pennsylvania, as I recall. But I have no doubt that the people of Pennsylvania were generous. I'm from Maryland originally. I call Minnesota home now because my wife is from Minnesota, and so we kind of settled down there. But I'm originally from Maryland, and just a couple of miles from the Pennsylvania border, around Harrisburg. If that helps you. I'm from Hagerstown, in and around Hagerstown, so Harrisburg is. I've been there a number of times, been to a number of concerts there, if that helps at all.
A few more questions here. So someone asked, do you think that the Midwestern states in general were more generous And did that have to do with them being high food producers?
You know, that is a good question, because they certainly were recognized. So Clara Barton, as I pointed out, specifically points to Iowa as as being more generous than every other state, and Drew Pearson points to Iowa as being more generous than every other state, as having donated the largest amount of food. And so this brings up an interesting question, like, what is it to be a Midwesterner, right? I told you I claim Minnesota as home now, and Minnesota nice is a real thing. I personally, I think it's Minnesota passive aggressive, but people from there call it, Minnesota nice, and does that have something to, does the way that the Midwest was settled with immigrants and people having to work together and forming communities, does that have something to do with it? Yeah, let's go with that. That the people in the Midwest are fundamentally different and more generous, probably because they can be, right? They've got this heritage, this history of working together, forming communities, and raising barns and that kind of stuff, helping out your neighbor, and during the war, when agricultural equipment is in such short supply, there are all kinds of stories about people finishing their own crops and then helping their neighbors bring in their crops. 1942, there's an incredible labor shortage, and the people, North Dakota simply shuts down all of their high schools and colleges for about 2 weeks, and all of the students go help farmers bring in the harvest in October of 1942. The football teams canceled their homecoming games, and everybody goes out and helps. Now, on the other side of this coin, are people from the Midwest the only generous people? Well, no, I don't think so. It's just that I happen to focus on the people of Iowa and the headlines of folks, and the generosity of folks in Iowa happen to leap out at me. So I guess I'll go on the record as saying the people in the Midwest are certainly generous, but I think everybody, as Americans, I guess kind of my point is these American values, not just Midwest values. I think there's something that we should maybe put some thought into as being a real thing, as opposed to what the Soviets are doing and the Germans are doing at this time, right? I mean, the Soviets and the Germans are murdering their POWs. We bring them to the United States, and they live in camps better than our own soldiers do, right? I mean, it's just the way that we do things. I guess democracies think differently than authoritarian governments. All right, I'm gonna stop it trying to answer that question now before I get myself into trouble.
It's funny that you were talking about Minnesota nice, because we also have Iowa nice, and I won't say whether or not I think that that's actually passive aggressive too. Another question is, how long did the voyage take to get the food to its destinations?
Only a little over a week. I think 10 days. In fact, one of the reasons that it was such a it was a thing was they really, for political purposes, really wanted to get the food to France and Italy before Christmas. And so I think the first ship shows up in France the 22nd of December, and they get it unloaded and start distributing the food before Christmas. And it's kind of a big deal, because the unions are controlled by communists who absolutely hate the United States being the heroes here, right? And so the communists are trying to stop the unions, especially those working on the docks, from unloading the ships. And the dock workers say, nope, we are going to work around the clock. And oh, by the way, we are doing this voluntarily. We don't demand to be paid. And then the second ship comes into Italy, I think the 23rd of December, like late in the afternoon, And at first, the Italian government is like, well, you know, it's a little late and it's nearly the holidays. We'll wait until after Christmas to unload the ship. And Pearson is there. He says, absolutely not. You need to get this thing unloaded today. And they again put out the call to the dock workers, and people show up volunteering their time because food is such an important aspect of life at this point. And if people recognize if we can distribute a little more food around Christmas time, then hey, that's something that we just need to do. And so, yeah, so it's to answer your question, it's pretty quick, less than 10 days. And to the point about, you know, the train bypassing Pennsylvania, it was all about speed in making a political statement to get the food distributed by Christmas.
All right, two more questions here. What group or individual devised the Marshall Plan? And did it have any difficulty being passed by Congress?
Okay, so great question. Marshall Plan, named for George C. Marshall, one of the greatest generals of World War II, who just happened to be the Secretary of State at the time. Now, Marshall is called the father of the Marshall Plan, but it had a lot of uncles, including Herbert Hoover, who said, look, you guys have got to figure out this manufacturing thing. And so the lack of food is a direct result of the lack of manufacturing. So you got to get the economy up and running. And so Marshall gives a speech at the Harvard graduation ceremony in June of 1947. And it's not until April of 1948 that it actually passes Congress. And one of the reasons is because in 1946, the Truman administration is absolutely devastated at the polls. The Democrats lose both houses of Congress in the midterm elections of 46. And what do the Republicans want to do? They want to pass a tax cut, right? I mean, people have been paying tons of money in taxes to get us through the war and to sponsor some of these Roosevelt administration programs. And so by 1946, the Republicans are, look, we can't afford to donate or loan all of this money to the Europeans. But then the Cold War starts rearing its ugly head, and the Soviets start being aggressive in Central and Eastern Europe, and so people realize, hey, this is more serious than we thought, and everybody, a very bipartisan Congress votes to pass the Marshall Plan in 1948. But it takes a while. And it takes a lot of serious rhetoric about the Cold War to get that thing passed. But and so the premise, right, is of the Marshall Plan is not a huge mystery. It's all about confidence, right? It's all about showing the European people that we are there and we're not leaving and that we will support you. Because $13 billion was really a drop in the bucket as to what the Europeans really required to get their economy back up and running. But the message that it sent, hey, we're Americans and we have the strongest economy in the world and the strongest, arguably the second strongest military, although lots of people get mustered out pretty quickly. But the message that it sends to Europe is all about confidence. We're not going to leave you. You're not going to be absorbed by the Soviet Union. We are there. And so a whole lot of the programs that like the currency reform, the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO is all about sending the message to the Europeans that America is not going to leave you stranded. America is not going to sacrifice you to the Soviets for our own comfort and our own economic well-being. And you have another one?
Yes. Can you talk more about Hoover's cookie that was high in protein and sent to Europe?
I'm sorry, Hoover's what?
Cookie.
Cookie?
Yes.
Hoover's cookie.
Hoover's cookie that was high in protein and sent to Europe.
I'm not familiar with the cookie. I probably read about it, but have not focused on it. Why don't you tell me about Hoover's cookie?
Man, we stumped you on the last one.
You absolutely did. I am positive,
Uh,
about
um,
Hoover's
do you
cookie.
do you want to talk a little bit about your book and promote that a little bit? Because I think your lecture was super interesting, and I think folks here would be interested to read more.
So I just finished the rough draft only a few weeks ago, and I sent it out to a press to take a look at, and so it's pretty early on in the whole process. But essentially, it's you don't need to buy the book. I've summarized the entire thing here pretty well. In fact, I've just simply ripped off the highlights from that book and included them here. But I think the name of that is going to be something like Bread for My Enemies. That's a title that I've been using in some of the things I've written, some of the presentations that I've given. But I think it's Bread for My Enemies, Feeding Germany in the Wake of World War II, or Feeding Germany at the Start of the Cold War. And essentially it's, so I've been a Cold War guy for a number of years, and every book about the Cold War begins in World War II, and then there's a paragraph about how Germany in Europe is starving, and then we fix the starving thing, and then the Soviets and the Americans proceed to nearly nuke each other throughout the next 4 decades, right? So every book that I've ever read really just skips over the whole part about feeding Europe and Germany specifically. So I started diving into a little bit, and as Kathy said earlier, I went to I got my graduate degree from North Dakota State, which is a wee bit of another agricultural state as well. And so I studied a fair amount of agricultural history, and it's just really, really interesting how farmers have these unsung heroes have really played such a pivotal role in the Cold War specifically. Like, I don't need to tell you about Khrushchev coming to Iowa and those sorts of things. I was also talking to Kathy about 1955. There was an exchange of Soviet and American farmers. Arguably the height of the Cold War, right? Where you would think that we would want to protect our secrets or our strength, which is agricultural production. Nope, we are showing the Soviets everything that they would ever want to know about how to maximize production on a farm. But turns out that the secret to American agricultural production is the harder that farmers work, the more crop they produce and the more money they make, theoretically, right? Which is exactly the opposite of the way communism works. And so it never really caught on. But thanks for asking that. Yeah, so it's been kind of a labor of love for about the last 5 years, trying to figure out what all this stuff means and how to put it all together. So.
All right, the person who asked about the cookie has written back in and said it was distributed to everyone at the Iowa State Fair a few years ago to honor Hoover.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. No wonder I don't know about it. I don't watch the news, and if it didn't happen more than 50 years ago, I don't really care much about it. All of my newspapers are from the 1940s and 1950s. But no, I'm kidding, obviously. But that is interesting. Whenever I tell people the story about Herbert Hoover and the great humanitarian that he was, nobody has ever heard those stories. Of course, they're not from Iowa either. I'm assuming that many of you have heard those stories. But I was absolutely fascinated that this guy is generally remembered for the economic policies in the Great Depression. But what an incredible human being he must have been. So thank you for clarifying the cookie story. I must have missed that state there.
Several people are writing in saying thank you for your presentation, and I would like to echo that. Fantastic presentation tonight, and thanks to all of the audience for watching.
Yes, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I very much appreciate being invited to speak to the audience, to yet another Iowa audience. So thank you.
Thanks. Have a good evening, everyone.